All right, so it is 4:02 according to my clock. And so I think we'll slowly get started and let people dial in. So just going down the participant list, I see we have Rosemary, Ariel, Cynthia, Frank, Dave Blewett, David Goldstein, Kirby Runyon, Kristen, Marcella, Michael, and Yang. Is there anyone else on the line who I missed? All right. So with that, our presenter today is someone who I think most of you know. Jim Head will be talking to us today about volcanically induced transient atmospheres on the moon and some work he and his colleagues have been doing to assess their duration, significance, and contribution to polar volatile traps. So Jim, I will hand it over to you, and I will ask everyone who is not speaking to mute themselves so we don't get any echoes. And Jim, would you prefer if we interrupt you with questions, or would you like us to wait till the end?
Uh, let's see, hugely pressing questions, that's fine. I usually run through this pretty fast and would like to have extended discussions at the end, but this is kind of like an informal session, so screech out if you can interrupt me, okay?
All right,
Otherwise, I'm
sounds
happy to answer questions throughout the end too. Okay,
awesome. Sounds good. Over to
okay,
you.
okay. Thanks a lot, and it's really great to be among friends here, friends of Lunar Volatiles. I love volatiles because they are really proxies for climate change, as well as a significantly important part of lunar and any planetary eruptions. As you can see here from this image, this is work on the left there at Pu'uo. In the 1980s, we spent an extensive amount of time monitoring eruptions and looking at gas exsolution patterns and what it did to to the variety of deposits that are produced from this, to try to deconvolve again the relationship of the rising magma and the degassing processes, and how you can use the deposits to recognize these on other planetary bodies. So I also want to acknowledge my co-authors, Lionel Wilson at Lancaster, Ariel Deutsch, who has just started, just got a PhD and is starting a postdoc at NASA Ames, Mac Rutherford, whom many of you know for sure, and Alberto Sola, both of Brown, who are working on essentially the petrological and gas exsolution aspects. Alberto was the one that kind of like, he and Eric Howry discovered the volatiles in the lunar green glass and other glasses, which really revolutionized our thinking about volatiles on the moon. So I want to talk about two things today. One, essentially transient atmospheres, but then switch to a second part of the topic, which is to think about actually what happens in volcanic eruptions, and how we can kind of forward model this to understand throughout time how much gas was coming out of these magmas and what its destinations and ultimate fate might have been. So we'll come back to that too. But let's start with basically the characteristics here of essentially lunar cold traps. These preaching to the choir here, so we won't spend any time on this at all, other than to say that there are these permanently shadowed regions inside craters located at the poles, and they represent the long-term cold traps that can capture and sequester volatile species. And of course, we know from a lot of discussions here on this group, the sources, including solar wind, asteroids, comets, and gas release from volcanic eruptions. And that's what I want to focus on today. It's also been shown that the transport of volcanic volatiles to the poles is enhanced by the presence of a transient atmosphere. Obviously, that facilitates things considerably. And a recent study by Needham and Kring 2017 concluded that, in fact, during a peak period of lunar volcanic activity at about 3.5 gigayears, a 1 kilopascal transient atmosphere, which is about 1.5 times that of Mars today, could have existed for 70 million years, and this really would enhance transport of magmatic volatiles to the polar cold trap. So when I heard this, I was somewhat surprised, but then really went back and looked at it, and of course this is one step in the our trying to understand exactly how much gas is coming out, what its fate is, and how it's contributing to the colder trap. So if we take a look at the Needham and Kring paper, they assessed Mare basalt flux basaltic flux. Basically, they used the work, a paper we did in 2011, Harry Hiesinger and colleagues, taking a look at the essentially dated Mare basaltic eruptions and looking at them as a function of time. And what they found was that during a period of peak lunar volcanic activity at about 3.5 gigayears, in fact, Mare basalt degassing was sufficiently high to produce essentially this 1 kilopascal transient atmosphere. And so what we have plotted here is mean volume, mass, and pressure. And you can see at 3.5 gigayears, this huge peak here, as well as, of course, in terms of the mass of volatiles, and then, of course, the atmospheric pressure derived from the mass of exhaled volatiles. And they point out that this could have lasted for 70 million years, and that this would indeed, as I said before, enhance transport of magmatic volatile cold traps. They calculated that this could explain potentially the entire source of what we observe currently, polar hydrogen and the poles. So in our analysis, taking a completely different approach to this, what we did was to forward model, okay? Let's take a look from another point of view. What we did was we look at gas release patterns from individual volcanic eruptions. And we then add those up and try to estimate the frequency, et cetera. So we address the question, is the volcanic flux and magma volatile content sufficiently high to produce a transient atmosphere and efficiently deliver volatiles to the polar permanent cold traps? So that's the kind of question we're going to do. And we approach this from a couple of different points of view. So we have, in a couple of bookend papers, we like to call them because they're sadly very large. These two papers, we took a look we did a synthesis of Mare basalt, magma, generation, ascent, and eruption. Starting from the source regions here, partial melting of a rising diapir, for example. What happens to the magma? When it's overpressurized, it propagates dikes to the surface, and they create eruptions depending on their depth, essentially different rheological traps, and a whole variety of things that are exhaustively treated in this the Wilson and Wilson paper here. And then we use the estimates of this magmatic volatile flux volatile mass fraction magmas. We adopt a value of about 2,000 parts per million. In this paper by Rutherford et al., this is something we published in 2017 in American Mineralogist, to look at the derivation of volatiles as a function of depth, overburden pressure, gas solubility, obviously, and essentially gas species, et cetera. And then we forward model this in the ascent and eruption of a typical Mare basalt. So that's what this diagram here is. We break it down, each Mare basalt eruption, a single eruption, into 4 phases, and we talk about the kinds of gas release that happens as a function of time. So let's just step back a second and think about the approach here. This gets into the second part of the discussion as well, which is that, basically, I'd like to view this in somewhat economic terms, if you follow me on that. So we have an inventory here, okay? How much of what species do we have on hand in a given eruption? And then we have a budget. How is this expended or spent, released as a function of time over the course of the duration of the eruption? That's what we'll talk about here. And then what are the product pathways? Once you produce something, that's the product. Where do the products end up? And more importantly, too, is how do they get there, okay? And this has to do with, is there a transient atmosphere, or are we talking about essentially no atmospheric assistance in optimizing the delivery of volatiles to the poles? So this is kind of the general I would say, strategy that we have. And so let's talk about each of these in a way that most of you are already familiar with. So on the left here, we have the 3 major phases of volcanic eruptions. And of course, that is a lunar lava flow in the upper left here in Mare Imbrium, several of them, in matter of fact. But these 3 are obviously on Earth, and they are, in fact, in Hawaii in the East Rift Zone. So what you see here are the initial penetration of the dike to the surface. So what is a dike? It's simply a magma-filled crack that's propagated by overpressurization of the source region, which creates a crack which fills with magma and propagates towards the surface. So that's what a dike is, okay? The first sign of an eruption is really, in addition to seismicity, of course, is when the dike penetrates to the surface. And this is typically a long fissure eruption here, which vents magma to the surface all the way along the line here. That's the dike reaching the surface, okay? It's a blade-like linear feature. And this goes on for typically 24 to 36 hours. And it's short because what's going on in the shallow, in the narrow part of the dike, basically you're getting conductive cooling of the dike, and it centralizes the eruption to the widest place in the dike. And that's what happens here. When you, in this phase, this dike penetration to the surface, after 24 to 36 hours, you begin the Hawaiian phase, which is a massive degassing of the magma. And this is where the vast majority of the volatiles come out, and also the vast majority of the essentially volume flux of the magma. Then you have a strombolian phase where, in fact, the eruption is dying down, and essentially the rise rate of the magma is very low. And actually the rise rate of the gas in the magma is greater than the rise rate of the magma itself. So you usually end up with a puddle of lava here, a lava pond in a caldera or a pit crater. And then the gas rises up, bursts on the surface to create strombolian activity. So I'm sure this is familiar to most of you, but I just wanted to review this. Of course, this is not what a Hawaiian eruption, I'm sorry, this is not what a lunar eruption looks like. They're very different because here we're talking about an atmosphere, a significant atmosphere, and also obviously 1G. So we'll talk about these variations and how they form on the moon in this diagram here, which are the 4 phases of the eruption. So what we do is we forward model a release of volatiles in the ascent and eruption of typical lunar basaltic magmas. I'll just go back to this a second. So in the first phase, the dike penetrates to the surface, much like this, okay? In the second phase, basically, magma is still rising in the dike, but in fact, you undertake here this Hawaiian phase. This is the vast majority of the volume of the dike is erupted over this. It's about 4 days for a typical eruption, whereas phase 1 is over in minutes, okay? And so indeed, then we go to the third phase, which is kind of a transition between Hawaiian and strombolian. Here, this occurs over the course of a few days. And basically what's going on is the flux is decreasing significantly from 5 to less than 1 meter per second. And then once it's down to these levels here, you enter the strombolian phase, in which the magma is rising very slowly. It has a lot of time to exhaust volatiles. And this is essentially the longest duration part of it, phase duration, and a lot of volatile activity associated with these, particularly in the vicinity of the event and elsewhere, which we'll get into in a couple of minutes. So we can map out the magma rise speed, the magma volume flux, the percent of the dike erupted, the phase duration, and also the amount of volatiles coming out as a function of time. So we basically forward model these, and we find that for typical eruptions are predicted to have volumes of about 10 to the 2, 10 to the 3, essentially 100 to 1,000 cubic kilometers. These are based on measurements of lava flows observed on the surface, like we saw at Mare, et cetera, and to last less than a year, and to, again, have a nonlinear but rapidly decreasing release rate of varying volatile species during individual eruptions. Well, what does that last mouthful mean? Basically, if we look at the magma volume flux, which you can see here, so this is magma volume flux as a function of time, essentially the volume flux decreases very rapidly in the first 2 stages here, so that by the strombolian phase, you're done basically. Okay, it's very, very, because of the low rise speed, the volume flux is way low here until the eruption itself terminates. And the other thing about this is that the volatile release, also 80% of it occurs in the first 2 phases. Shown here is the percentage of total volatile is erupted in the time. And you can see here in phase 1 and 2, that's where the vast majority, over 80% of the volatiles come out, both CO and magma and water. Magma, flux, water, and CO come out at about this time. There are some variations here as a function of time, but for the first order, it's all over in the first couple of phases here, the dike penetration to the surface and the Hawaiian phases. So what this means is then when we have most of the balls coming out very rapidly in the individual eruptions. The second thing we want to try to do is to estimate the frequency of Mare basalt eruptions. This is the repose period between eruptions, okay? So when we think about that, that's typically, right now, Kilauea in Hawaii is in a repose period. It is not erupting at the present time. In fact, as a side note here, it's a very scary time at Kilauea because, in fact, Halima'oma'o, the caldera lake, is filling with water. And, that means that magma has withdrawn, groundwater has flowed into the caldera, and it is just a matter of time before there's a free magmatic eruption. I mean, it would be really unbelievable if one of those didn't happen. And they can be extremely explosive and hurl boulders for many, many hundreds of meters and sometimes kilometers. So that's kind of interesting, and that's happening. So the repose period between eruptions is what we're interested in here. What's the time between eruptions? Because that's critical for understanding whether you can pump out enough volatiles to actually get a transient atmosphere. So how do we calculate this? Well, Mare basalts is shown by this summary diagram. The purple is Mare. These are cryptomare. This is a synthesis diagram from Jenny Whitten. Jenny Whitten's work. Covers less than 20% of the moon, and there's estimated to be a total volume of about 10 to the 7th cubic kilometers. We know that Mare basalt volcanism peaks early in lunar history and declines rapidly. This is a plot from our New Views of the Moon 2 chapter. And what it's composed of is the Hiesinger et al. Individual dated volcanic eruptions, the number of these as a function of time. Okay, so it isn't necessarily the complete flux, it's a number of these eruptions as a function of time, but clearly between 3 and 4, that's where the peak volcanism is for the exposed Mare basalts and the cryptomare. So when we take a look at these then and estimate the typical erupted volume of 100 to 300 cubic kilometers, the total Mare volume, and the 2 gigayear duration, we get a total of 30 to 60,000 individual eruptions, and then an average repose period of 20,000 to 60,000 years. So what that means, it's an average, okay, but what it means is a long time between individual eruptions, and even in an individual eruption, the volatiles are going to be coming out in the first part of the eruption. So what we conclude from this, then, even if you take 3 times as much magma in a narrow phase here, the repose period is still over 13 to 40,000 years. And so the eruption frequency is insufficient, we would argue, to form a transient atmosphere. There just isn't enough coming out with individual eruptions, and there isn't enough coming out with eruptions stacked up against one another because the repose period is too long and the total volatiles are also relatively small amounts. So when we think about this then, eruption outgassing and eruption frequency seem to be insufficient to form a transient atmosphere. And so we conclude that volcanic volatile outgassing in a transient atmosphere is not a significant contributor to polar ice deposits. Now that doesn't mean that volcanism isn't contributing to something, and that's what we'll talk about in the second part of the discussion here. So basically, why is it that our values differ so much from those of Needham and Kring? Needham and Kring did a first order estimate, so it's a step in the right direction for sure. I want to point out 2 reasons why we think ours are different than theirs, and then talk, and thirdly, about what we need to get better estimates of this, which is related to a couple of the assumptions they made. And you have to make assumptions in lieu of knowing the 3-dimensional data of a lot of these things. So let's talk about this first. Let's talk about their use of maximum impact basin depths as average depth. So this is one of the reasons we think their estimates are significantly higher than ours. So if we take a look at how they approach this, basically we have lunar volcanic activity filling a basin like Imbrium, and you want to figure out how much lava is in that basin, how much, what the total volume of lava is, and how it varies as a function of time. You can't see the substructure of Imbrium. There are hints from superposed craters and their excavation. We do have things like Oriental topography, which is a fresh lunar basin with very little lavas in it, so we can learn something about the structure of these basins. And basically, they're tiered, if you will, like a series of individual hockey pucks of different thicknesses. So how did Needham and Kring approach it? Well, what they did was they basically tried to estimate the volume in the subsurface by first taking the observed basin diameter, and they use the outer basin ring here, which is typically would be the Imbrium basin ring in Mare Imbrium, for example, the largest of the basin rings. And then they basically derive the depth of the basin from basin depth diameter relationships, okay, which is not an unreasonable thing to do. They used Zuber et al. And others in early estimates of the diameter and depth of the basin from gravity data and other things. And then they subtracted from the rim crest to the surface, they subtracted off that volume. And then what they did in the final step was to assume that the adjusted maximum depth, which is just this minus this, is equal to the average depth. And this is, I think, where a problem is introduced, because it makes essentially the whole basin fill a simple disc, a hockey puck-like shape. And we know the basins aren't like that. So we think this significantly overestimates the total basaltic volume. So that's one source of the difference between these. The second thing they did was to look at trying to estimate the total volumes, that total volume, and date it, okay? This is critically important. What is that? Because that'll help you to understand the flux. So the problem with this is, and I think one of the reasons our estimates differ, is that basically they assign all the excess volume below a datable surface to a single age. So let's take a look at that quickly for a second. So here's Imbrium, for example, and you've got all these lava flows here that have been dated in a Hiesinger et al. Paper. And you can see the ages here. They're quite variable in here, okay? But what you want to know is what the lavas below these are, what the ages of those are as well, because you see a spectrum of ages in here. So to follow their logic, basically, they dated flow units on the surface, okay? Those are the Hiesinger et al. And then they said, okay, there's some below this, the undated and underlying flow units, which they assigned a specific age. And then there's this excess volume, that is the hockey puck-like volume that is below the datable surface flows. So their logic is good here and here, but when they get to this, I think one of the reasons for the difference in the volumes is that the excess unit is assigned a single age based on the date, the age of the oldest flow. And of course, this unit is certain to be multiple flow units of different ages, thicknesses, volumes, and durations. And quite frankly, we don't know what those are. But I would argue from a thermal evolution and volcanological point of view that it's probably not, it's certainly not one age. So this excess volume overestimated, the excess volume, this is an overestimate due to the assumption that maximum basin thickness equals the average thickness as well as this here. So these are the things, just as an illustration, that you'll see here. So here's Imbrium, okay, and we're trying to date all these flows using this technique here. And so again, if you essentially assign all the excess flow volume to the date of the oldest flow here, then essentially that's the green, and 95%, 95.2% of the lavas in Imbrium will come out to be one age. And we think that's a 3.5 gigayear. So we think that's why they got this huge peak here, which we don't think is necessarily real based on our lack of knowledge about, actually our almost certain knowledge that it's not just one age, and also that the average depth is not, the maximum depth is not the average depth. This is the same for Serenitatis. You can see here, Mare Serenitatis, same problem here. That's what produces this peak. So rather than these two peaks, then we would say these are probably spaced out more in individual eruptions, which are separated by repose periods that are at least 1,000 to 10,000 years long and unlikely to produce this. So bottom line is they use the maximum impact basin depth as the average depth, and then they assign all the excess volume below datable units to one age. We have to make these estimates, okay? Those are the ones they chose. And really what we need are better estimates of basin geometry and the ages of buried units. We need really new data from geophysics and geology to assess these questions here. But our findings and our conclusions in the GRL paper, and the details are laid out, of course, in the supporting online material as well, suggest that there's a lot less volatiles released, and that it is really, really very hard to create a transient atmosphere that would help volatiles increase the probability that the volatiles get to the poles. It doesn't mean they're not volatiles from volcanic eruptions, but certainly not with atmospheres that appear to last of the order of 70 million years. Well, what does happen during individual volcanic eruptions? So this gets back to the question, and this is the work that we're doing right now, undertaking right now. So again, for basaltic volcanic eruptions, what are the volatile inventories, the budgets, the pathways, and the destinations? So again, this is forward modeling. We're trying to figure this out. So I want to spend the rest of the time here sharing with you the positive work going forward, where we're trying to take this alternate technique of forward modeling these eruptions and figure out where the volatiles are coming out, how much there are, and where it's going. So again, we go back to our diagram here of what I like to call inventory, budget, pathways, and destination. How much of the species do we have on hand in a given eruption? This is from the Rutherford et al. Paper, for example. How is this expended? How is it spent or released as a function of time? That is the duration of the eruption. And then what are the product pathways? Once it's erupted, where does it go? And this is where the discussions we've had in previous versions of this seminar have really been productive in terms of thinking about pathways and essentially products, pathways, and then destinations. That's critically important. Do they get to the poles? Do they not get to the poles? Do they leave the planet? This is really, really important. And that's what we're trying to get to in our continuing work. So what are we trying to do? I want to give you a list of the areas that we're investigating here so you can get an idea. And I really seek questions, assistance, and collaboration. If you see something you think you might be able to contribute to in our endeavors, I really hope you'll email me, and we can talk about ways in which this is a huge parameter space, and we need all the help we can get, to put it mildly. So we're trying to look at the release of magmatic volatiles in each phase of the eruption. We're looking at the variations in the volatile species that are released, okay? You'll see when we get to the details here that different volatiles are released as a function of time. We want to know their variation as a function of phase in the eruption, total volcanic flux, and speciation of the volatiles. Do we know indeed that all eruptions have the same volatile content? Absolutely not. And this is a parameter space that is really hard to explore because we have a limited array of pyroclastic samples. We have the Apollo 15, primarily 15 and 17 green and orange black glass beads. There are other fragments, etc., but we're not sure where they came from. We don't know the provenance of those exactly. So we really have a lot of work to do thinking about the total flux, okay, and speciation. So, what is the magma volatile content of a typical eruption, Mare basalt eruption? What is the range of volatile contents? We see evidence that some magmas that are erupting on the moon may have very little volatile content, and actually maybe none at all, okay? And we see other evidence that suggests a few of them have huge volatile contents. So what is that? We're working on trying to figure that out from both a petrogenetic point of view as well as observational point of view. And how does this map out into what I call a volatile hydrograph? Those of you who have a geological background know that a hydrograph is simply the flux. Think a stream or a river. It's just the flux of water as a function of time. So we could think about a volatile hydrograph too. What is the flux of volatiles with time, and the speciation, also critically important. Then we want to know the dispersal of these volatiles in each eruption phase. We'll see, for example, that some of these, like in phase 1, are very high velocity. That's the CO mainly. And then we see in some of these other ones with the lava flows, really it's diffusional. I mean, the volatiles are not actually coming out of the magma. Maybe they're diffusing through the lava flow as it's cooling. Maybe they're diffusing afterwards. So there's rate changes here as well that we need to take into consideration. And then, of course, what's the effect of total volatile content over a wide range? And again, this gets back to what is the range of volatile contents of lunar magmas? Based on the knowledge we have so far, it can be pretty huge. And again, the effects of the total volume, we talked about modeling things over a range of volumes, but we know that those total volumes differ as a function of location and time, okay? Imagine a dike propagating to the surface in a period of time early in lunar history when the net state of stress of the lithosphere was essentially extensional versus when later on when it's contractional and you have, again, a more difficulty getting the magma out. Total volumes are going to differ as a function of time as well. And then, of course, what are the potential of these for contributions to a transient atmosphere? What species, what pressures, what's the duration? These are the kinds of things we're striving for, just as Needham and Kring were trying to do, in their EPSL paper. So what's the effect of vent location? This is kind of important and interesting. If you have a vent that's up here near the North Pole, do all the volatiles go to the North Pole, or do they disperse and go equally to the cold traps? You all know better the answer to that than I do. But we also know where many of these eruptions are, so we can model that. And also, are there daytime and nighttime differences? When an eruption occurs during the day, will there be different dispersal patterns than when it occurs at night, lunar night? So thermal pathways for erupted gases, this is also important. Clearly, volatile fate relative to contributions to North and South polar cold traps. Where does most of the material go? Is there even any variation once you erupt, say, in the equatorial or high latitude regions? These are questions that we need to think about. And here's one that Ariel Deutsch has been working on recently, which is what polar cold traps were available at the time of the eruption. So, we can look at the cold traps now, but many of the craters that formed in the North and South polar regions weren't there when, in fact, many of these eruptions took place. So we have to map that out as well. And Ariel has published a recent paper in GRL and doing more work on that as well. And then if that's not enough confusion, where are the poles at the time of the eruption? We indeed have, Matt Ziegler and others have argued that we have evidence for true polar wander. And Dave Smith and myself and a number of people with the Lola team and the Grail team are going back and trying to reconstruct the effects of essentially increasing basin location and size on true polar wander. So these are unknowns as well. I don't want to make this too complicated because really I want to focus on the volcanology today. But these last three slides are kind of our roadmap for the studies that we're undertaking right now. These are the questions we're addressing, and these are the questions we want to try to answer. So let's go back to this, and then I just want to walk through very briefly each of these phases here, so you can get some idea of the kinds of things we're thinking about in terms of gas release, its velocity, its abundance, and what kinds of effects that has, and where we might look for different parts of the evidence for these kinds of eruptions using remote sensing data and rover and human exploration data. So first of all, just a quick primer. You all are very familiar with this, but obviously patterns of volatile release on the Earth are totally different than they are on the Moon. On the Earth, on the left here, basically 1 bar atmosphere. This atmosphere tends to collimate the plume, okay? And as the hot gases rise, they in fact suck in and make turbulent this eruption cloud, which causes it to buoyantly rise. It gets to a neutral buoyancy level, spreads out, drops down ash, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, also at 1G, there's higher overburden pressure. Gas release is dominantly shallow, and they're basically most of the gas is coming out in the upper hundreds of meters of the dike itself as it's erupting to the surface. So on the Moon, obviously, there's no atmosphere; it's a vacuum. Magma that gets to the surface and erupts and exhaled gases. This undergoes immediate gas expansion. And instead of a nice beautiful Mount St. Helens-like plume here, you get basically a pyroclastic fountain like you see on Io, and certainly was the way it worked on the moon, with an optically dense interior and essentially an optically less dense exterior here. And the expanding gas accelerates pyroclast, and the pyroclast will decouple from the gas and then follow ballistic trajectories from that. So basically no atmosphere, vacuum, accelerated gas expansion, plume behavior is completely different. And the characteristics of the ejecta is dictated by cloud optical density, again, low overburden pressure, and essentially very deep magma sources. This is another region that's quite different oftentimes than the Earth. Most of the magma sources are relatively shallower on the Earth compared to the moon, which can be up to several hundreds of kilometers. And we also know that there's deep formation of CO, as well as shallower exsolution of H2O, SO2, and other volatiles on the moon. So let's talk about phase one here. This is really interesting because essentially, as the dike is rising from the depth, this is the magma molten rock fill crack, the dike. Essentially, this area up here, the dike tip, because it cracks open, it creates essentially a zero, essentially a zero pressure zone, okay, as the dike tip cracks and opens. And that means that there's an upper gas zone because gas can form in this low pressure region formed by the expanding crack. And this can produce a gas zone followed by a segregated magmatic foam. Magmatic foams are just simply very, very vesicular material overlying undegassed magma. Well, when that propagates to the surface, and instead of having a nice curtain of fire like we see in Hawaii, all hell breaks loose because this gas is venting to the surface. And this expands, up to 5 kilometers per second, transparent gas out to so this is huge and fast, okay? The volume of gas is related to, of course, the size of the dike, its depth, and the amount of propagation distance it's gone. This can accelerate xenolithic grains to hundreds of kilometers, okay? That would be just rock, okay? Because the gas itself is not going to contain any magma in it. But then as the rest of the dike propagates and reaches the surface, that's when you get this transparent gas cloud and a pyroclastic cloud. So bottom line here, in this first phase one, you get a lot of gas coming out, primarily CO, as a function of a very short period of time. So let's take a look then at phase two. So as the dike gets to the surface, is rising relatively fast, 10 to 20 meters per second, not as fast as the initial propagation. The CO is produced with depth, and H2O and other volatiles exsolve at less than 500 meters. And basically what happens here is that this degassing again creates this optically underdense outer portion and an optically very dense, opaque inner part of the plume. And the thing about optical density is it just means, can you see through it or not? And if you can't, that means that the particles are very close together so that they are not conductively cooling very well. When they radiate away, their heat away, they're just radiating it into more magma right next to it. So the optical density is such that the cloud is still extremely hot. And these pyroclasts drop to the surface in the vicinity of the vent, and they're actually still completely molten. And so that turbulence here can actually thermally erode a fire fountain, area here, and produce essentially a thermally eroded lava lake in the vicinity of the vent. This, of course, fills up and it overflows, and this creates lava flows, typically because of a slope away from the vent that extends out to create many of the long, extensive lava flows we see on the surface of the moon. This really occurs over a long period of time, a few days anyway, but the bottom line is the vast majority of the gas is coming out here in this particular phase. So in contrast, this comes out more slowly, but there's a lot more gas that's coming out, and it's also dominated by a combination of the CO gas and the and the shallower exsolving gas. Now, in work we're currently doing right now, we've just submitted a paper to JVGR on theory of lunar pyroclastic eruptions. And one of the things that's pretty clear is that sinuous real source regions, such as you see here, are almost certainly linked to total magma volatile content, because the magma volatile content determines the geometry of the cloud, and that determines where the thermal erosion is taking place. Once you get out of the optically underdense portion of the fountain, it's not hot enough to actually create the lava lake. So what you're looking at here, the sun is coming from this direction. Maybe this is a better one to show. It's the same one, just different illumination geometry. This is this depression around the vent. Here's the flow and the sinuous reel heading away. And the diameter of both of these are testimony to what the volatile content was at that time during the eruption. So this is a way we can actually get at what's going on with total volatile content. Because if we see sinuous rills with no vent and just essentially emerging from the ground, it's quite likely that they were very volatile poor. So again, we're planning to use this to estimate the volatile content of all the sinuous rill source regions, and we're in the process of assessing that data right now. And there's quite a variety, okay? This is a good indication that not all magmas that are erupting have the same volatile content. More on that maybe in an upcoming seminar. The other thing is that we can link the characteristics of the samples at Apollo sites, Luna sites that have been returned to the Earth based on this whole geometry of the cooling of the optically dense and optically underdense portions of the plume. So if you take a look here in this work by Kathy Weitz some years ago, we had a whole series of these working with Mac Rutherford on a lot of the Apollo 17 orange glasses. And we were able to point out what proximal and distal deposits would look like. And we're able to link to parts of this cloud here, orange glasses, partially crystallized glass, significant crystallization, and completely crystallized beads. And what's going on here, the bottom line is, if they are in the outer portion here, optically underdense portion, they will in fact cool very fast and create glass. They'll quench. But if they're in here, in fact, they'll partially to wholly essentially crystallize. And so that's a really important parameter here, which we can use to reconstruct the sources of some of these pyroclastic glasses. And in this theory paper, we try to link where the location of the vent was to the Apollo 17 orange glasses and black glasses, as well as the Apollo 15 green glasses. So there's also gas released in a much less significant portion, but still nonetheless gas released. So if we, in phase 2, most of the volatiles are lost in this lava fountaining, Hawaiian fountaining phase, okay? So when the lava settle back down, they've lost a lot of their volatiles. They flow out into the surrounding regions. They still have volatiles, but they just haven't been, they're just not as much as the original magma. And the initial phases of the flow, because the flux is so high here, is turbulent. And turbulent flow obviously means that you're essentially, well, it's like those little diagrams there. You're turbulently moving the magma, and that brings undegassed magma up to the surface. It can, in fact, degas. And until the flow becomes laminar, there's a lot of additional gas loss that occurs here. So when the flow becomes laminar, the thermal boundary layer on the top, that is the boundary layer between the hot lava and space, essentially keeps much of the volatiles from being released here, so they can actually build up in here, but here you're losing them. So here's a place where you're losing magma, lower rate, etc. Here's a place where there's much less volatiles being lost. Okay, so those are different dimensions of where we might get these types of things. So let's go to the Hawaiian phase 3. We're lurching towards a conclusion here. If we take a look at Hawaiian strombolian transition phase, this is simply just the difference between this major eruption phase and the strombolian phase. And the bottom line is basically magma rise rate is decreasing here from about 5 to 1 meter per second. And this gives the volatiles a chance to not just exsolve, but also to grow and coalesce. So as bubbles rise, they overtake one another, and you start to get produced here what are known as slugs of gas, typically in this case, in the lunar one, CO gas. So when this comes up to the surface, you really get this strombolian activity because these bubbles have magma on the top, and when they get to the surface and burst, they produce the classic strombolian activity. So let's go to the strombolian activity in phase 4. And why is the eruption rate decreasing? Because essentially what's going on here is that the dike is propagated, the reservoir with depth overpressurization has essentially decreased, and so the magma rise rate is lowering. And then the key point in this last phase here is that the viscous forces that are essentially, the elastic forces that are holding the dike open start to relax, okay? So this takes place over, it's not instantaneous, they just start to relax. And what happens is, at the low rise rate, this starts to push the magma out of the upper part of the dike, okay? So imagine a dike closing here, lots of time spent in this upper part here to enhance degassing. And what you have here are a variety of different features. I want to show an example of each one because these are really fascinating in terms of documentation of the geological features that might exist. Let's talk about the lava lake at this point, okay? So if we take a look at this lava lake, you've got essentially a cooling, rise rate is lower, so you've got a cooling boundary layer at the top, essentially the floor of a lava lake. You've got hot lava underneath that in the lava lake, and you got a lot of volatiles coming out here to essentially collect at the bottom of this boundary layer. So if you take a look at this, then here is a candidate lava lake, okay? You've got this upper boundary layer here, which is here. We think this is really going to be macrovesicular with a lot of void space in it. This is the Apollo 15 seatbelt basalt. You can see incredible vesicularity in this, as well as other samples from Apollo 15. And then below that, you're really building up magmatic foam, okay? And as the dike squeezes, the crack closes, you start to squeeze this foam up, crack this boundary layer surface, and we think that maybe you, in fact, can extrude this magmatic foam out onto the surface. And when this happens, you actually get explosive decompression of the volatiles here. But the bottom line here, inside, it should be essentially a magmatic foam that's like a pumice, okay? Most of you know pumice, you put it in the water, it'll float in the water. It's extremely, 70 to 75, 80% volume percent gas, okay, volatiles, vesicles. And it's possible that this INA feature, this 2 by 3 kilometer perspective view here, these are mounds, okay? They're on the floor of this lava lake, ancient lava lake. And we think that it's possible that, in fact, this is the topography though, so you can see it because it's really hard sometimes to wrap your head around these as mounds, but they are. So it's possible then, we even explored the possibility that these could be extruded foams, such as you see here. And one of the things you probably know from the discussions of the INA feature is that it could be one of the Braden et al. Paper argued that these are less than 100 million years old, represent some of the most recent volcanism. That's certainly a possibility we're investigating. Another possibility is that you're actually recording impacts that are going into vesicular pumice. And as you see with impacts into aerogels, essentially the crushing part of it takes precedence over, in terms of the energy partitioning, over, in fact, lateral ejection and modification. So we're looking into the possibility that these really young ages could actually be due to the nature of the substrate of both the mounds themselves as well as the intervening substrate. So that's, TBD. Secondly, you will have essentially proximal foam-rich flows that extrude through cracks, okay? These could come out under the flanks of the eruption. We've done some work on one of these other dated to the last 100 million years features, Koshi 5. This is what it looks like. It's a small shield volcano with a summit depression. One of the things we see is that out here on the flanks here, there's lots of evidence for these types of essentially irregular Mare patches that differ from those that are in the vent itself. So we think this may be due to the fact that in the waning stage of the eruption, these very vesicle-rich flows actually extrude out onto the flanks of the eruption to create this extremely porous and vesicle-rich material, which is then broken up from impacts, etc. So that's another possibility. So the key here is that we see lots of variations that might exist in these later stages here. And let's take a look at what's going on over here. As the lava is coming out, as the magma is coming out here, it can also intrude into pre-existing flows. This is called flow inflation. So even these flows out here we were talking about earlier could get rejuvenated, if you will. And flow inflation can actually, shown here, this is a vertical view of an inflated flow out here, 14 to 17.5 meters, for example, from flow inflation. And then the other thing that can happen in here, this brings volatiles again out to areas where they will diffuse out. This can also, during flow solidification, cause essentially second boiling. That is to say, the decrease in temperature creates a temperature pressure threshold in which more volatiles are exsolved. And when this happens, then you get some really unusual predictions for what will happen inside the lava flow. So you have a lot of lava exsolving. In fact, this material can, in fact, migrate vertically as the bubbles rise. You still have partially molten cores, and we've modeled a lot of different things that can go on in here. Not the least of which is you may, in fact, get overpressurization of the lava flows themselves as they're solidifying, and essentially eruption of foams out onto the surface. Now, this sounds really ridiculous. If you, just there's a lot of modeling going on here. Well, is there any evidence for this? And the answer is that there is some. In a paper we wrote, when was it? 2017, followed up by a couple of papers in JGR. We've documented the characteristics of what are called ring-moat dome structures, okay? These are really kind of unusual. So here's a picture of the lunar Mare in Tranquillitatis. Here are craters. The sun is coming from this direction. These are depressions. But if you look closely at this image, you'll see a whole bunch of mounds. I mean, these are not craters, these are mounds. And when you look at these things, they in fact, these ring moat dome structures, generally circular shape, dome-like morphology, they have a surrounding moat, and a lot of other features. They occur in clusters. They're only found in certain Mare regions. We think these could be due to this flow inflation and second boiling. So we're testing those hypotheses. But the point is, you could actually have a volatile loss in these flows after they've come to rest, not just by diffusion, but also by eruption of these foams and loss of some of the volatiles into the atmosphere. So again, there's lots going on out here as well. So the point of this, I hate to say kind of tirade at this point, is that, hey, there are lots of different places where volatiles are coming out. And the last thing I want to just mention here is, what's the range of the repose periods? This is another question we have. What is the range of repose periods? That is to say, the nature of eruption episodicity. Excuse me. So how do we improve the flux and repose period estimates? We have all these dated lava flows. So what we're doing now is we're taking a look at the characteristics of the surface of the moon and looking and mapping out the sequence of these eruptions and estimating their volume as a function of time. Okay, we don't know what Needham and Kring were trying to estimate, which are the ones below what we see on the surface, but we can get a much better idea of what's going on by dating these. And so what I'm going to show you here to end up here is a movie which has all the eruptions dated by Hiesinger et al. In the 2011 paper. Every 2 seconds is 100 million years, so hang on to your hat. When a unit is emplaced, you will hear a dot. You will hear a beep and you'll see a dot to show its location. And the dots are color coded by age, and this scale down here at the bottom will be an indication of what that is. So we'll watch this clock go here. We'll watch the locations. The black line is the PKT terrain. The red lines are near side, far side, and the map color scale is in Grail crustal thickness. So take a look here, and what we're trying to do during this, okay, so watch this now, okay, 3.9, 3.8. Now, what we're trying to do here is now we're going to fold in the volumes okay, and estimated volatile contents of each of these. So we'll have a really quantitative estimate of what's going on as a function of time, at least for the period that we can see the dated flows. So you'll notice here, we're now down to 2.9, okay, very widespread, not all in the PKT terrain, and 2.6. Now we're into the areas you'll sense the dots are slowing down a little bit here, certainly in terms of number, and now you'll start hearing them decrease in terms of frequency. So at a 1.9, there's none. 1.8, there's some, near side, far side. 1.6, 1.5. Decreasing in number and frequency, totally consistent with our map, okay, of our knowledge of the flux. And then we're going to go 0.8, 0.7, and we'll get down to the last three, which are the irregular Mare patches in the last 100 million years. So again, according to the Bradenetto hypothesis, volcanism comes alive essentially at this 3.9, at this last 100 million years of lunar history. Okay, so I'm just going to finish by saying we're on the case and trying to understand, again, volatile inventory, the budget, the pathways, and destinations. How much of what species do we have on hand in a given eruption? How is this expended as a function of time? And then what are the product pathways? This is the last stage. This is the last step. And we need all the help we can get from you all on this. Is when we have an eruption in a certain place and we kind of had a sense of what the inventory and budget is, what indeed are the pathways and the destinations. It doesn't appear that there's a significant transient atmosphere, that is to say, one that would aid the transport of the volatiles to the polar regions, but they got to go somewhere. So this is where we need your help. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
All right, thanks, Jim. Yeah, this was really interesting, very exciting work, and yeah, I feel like I learned a lot, and you know, I'm excited to see where this problem goes. It's a really neat problem to work on. So we are almost at the hour. We have time for maybe one or two quick questions. I'm just looking at the chat to see what's come in. So it looks like Michael had a question that I think Ariel answered to some extent. And then Kurt Rutherford says, I'm happy to see that Jim's analysis got the loss rate of 10 kilograms per second in the right ballpark. And Rosemary, have you and OJ made progress on the early atmospheric loss work that you presented at EPSC? Kurt asks. So I think this was, so I let Rosemary answer, but just for context, I think, so I know OJ Tucker and Rosemary and others have been working on trying to address, you know, one of the issues you raised, Jim, which is, you know, how long could an atmosphere persist? So Rosemary, did you want to chime in on that question of Kurt's?
Yeah, it turns out that the loss rate really depends a lot on the assumed the volatiles and the, you know, the background gas, and how you know, the different phases. So yeah, I mean, it's really dependent on exactly what you assume, which it makes it more interesting, but not as definitive as we initially said, that it would escape very fast. It really depends on what's escaping and how at the rate.
Well, that sounds like it would be really helpful, even though it's more complex potentially, is that maybe the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of the temporal aspects of the volatile species might be really helpful in helping to refine.
Yeah, exactly. I need to check and see if that paper has been accepted, but yeah, it's much more complicated when you start looking at exactly what species, what's the gas, what's the background,
Yep.
and how fast did it come out? It really is complicated. But I think, yeah.
But we have that, we have those data, I think. You know, we can actually provide some basically model input. That is to say, you know, here's a typical eruption, we think, and here's what's coming out as a function of time. That's implicit in the kind of modeling we're doing. So that might be really helpful to make next steps. So let me know. Yeah, please do send the paper if it's
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just, it's very interesting, you know, when you put in the details and it gets more complicated, but more interesting.
it's kind of like nature, you know.
Exactly.
All right, so I'm going to let Yang have the last question, which is, so Yang says, Jim, very nice talk. Usually a significant amount of magma remains unerupted under the surface. And has the model considered degassing from unerupted magma?
Yes, indeed. And that I didn't mention that. Lord knows, you know. Anyway, yeah. So yes, both the magma. So diffusion is a critical issue. Okay, so basically we have calculated the cooling time for dikes of various widths. Okay, so that's really what the kind of thing that's so important, because once the magma stops rising, then the degassing bubbles will continue to rise to the surface. But they'll be trapped underneath the boundary layer in the lava lake or at the vent itself. And that can diffuse out, but the time scales for that are really, really long. And the solidification of the lava takes place within months to a couple of years. And so once that happens, the diffusion, of course, is even longer, as I understand it. So basically it is a factor, and we have some numbers for that, but they're relatively small and also over long, much longer periods of time. But any thoughts on that would be really helpful.
All right, awesome. So since we are a little past 5, and I know people have families and other Zoom meetings to run to, so what I'm going to do is to encourage people to reach out to Jim via email if they have more questions. I'm probably going to send you an email sometime over the next few days, Jim, because this has sparked some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the data dump. It's just so exciting, you know, to me, and I hope I've been able to share some of that. But I would say if you want to take a portion of some upcoming FOLV meeting, you know, to continue to answer or discuss questions, I'm happy to do that anytime. You just let me know, okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. All right. So with that, thanks again, Jim, for a great presentation, and thanks everyone for dialing in. And we will meet again in November. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.